The black Bentley pulled up to the Grandview Country Club with a screech of expensive tires. Richard Sterling stepped out, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished stone steps. Everything about him screamed money, from his custom-tailored suit to the gold watch that cost more than most people's cars. At 35, Richard had built a tech empire worth $200 million, and he never let anyone forget it. Today was supposed to be perfect. His engagement party to Catherine Ashford, daughter of one of the city's oldest banking families, was set to be the social event of the season. But traffic had been terrible. His assistant had messed up his schedule, and now he was running late to his own celebration. "Good evening, sir," came a polite voice from the club's entrance. "May I see your invitation, please?" Richard stopped mid-stride and turned to see who had dared to delay him. Standing by the heavy wooden doors was a man in his early 40s, wearing the club's standard Doorman uniform. His name tag read Michael Thompson. The man had kind eyes and graying hair at his temples, but Richard barely noticed these details. All he saw was someone he considered beneath him. "Are you kidding me?" Richard's voice rose immediately. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Michael kept his calm, professional smile. "I'm sorry, sir, but club policy requires everyone to show their invitation. It's for security purposes." "Security?" Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm Richard Sterling. I practically own half this city. This party is for me." Other guests were starting to notice the commotion. Well-dressed couples slowed their steps as they approached the entrance, curious about what was happening. Michael glanced around nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the growing attention. "Sir, I understand, but I still need to see your invitation." "It's the same rule for everyone." Richard's face turned red. The stress from his day, combined with his natural arrogance, boiled over into pure rage. "Listen here, you nobody. I don't follow rules meant for regular people. Do you know how much money I've spent at this club? More than you'll make in your entire worthless life." "Richard!" A woman's voice cut through his rant. Catherine Ashford appeared at the top of the steps, elegant in her designer gown. Her long blonde hair was perfectly styled, and diamonds sparkled at her throat, but her expression showed embarrassment and disappointment. "What's going on?" "This doorman is giving me attitude," Richard snapped, pointing at Michael like he was identifying a criminal. "He's demanding to see my invitation like I'm some random person off the street." Catherine looked between the two men. She'd known Michael for years. He'd been working at the club since before her family joined. He'd always been nothing but respectful and professional. "Michael is just doing his job, Richard. Everyone shows their invitation. Even my father does." "Well, your father doesn't run a company worth hundreds of millions," Richard shot back. He turned to Michael, his voice getting louder. "You want to see power? Real success? Look around you. See all these people? They're here because of me. Not because of some doorman who peeked at opening doors for his betters." The crowd that had gathered was now quite large. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others seemed fascinated by the drama. Michael stood quietly, taking the abuse with dignity, but his hands were clenched at his sides. "You know what your problem is?" Richard continued, stepping closer to Michael. "You have no ambition, no talent. You're 40-something years old, and this is as good as your life gets. Opening doors and saying yes, sir, to people who actually matter." "Richard, please." Catherine tried again, touching his arm. "You're making a scene." But Richard was beyond stopping now. The audience only made him feel more powerful. "No, Catherine, this is important. People need to understand their place in the world. Some of us are meant to lead, to create, to build empires. Others," he gestured dismissively at Michael, "others are meant to serve, and they should be grateful for the opportunity." Michael finally spoke, his voice still calm but with a slight edge. "I understand you're upset, Mr. Sterling. Perhaps we could discuss this privately." "Privately?" Richard laughed loudly. "No, I think everyone should hear this. You represent everything that's wrong with people today. No drive, no vision, no special abilities whatsoever. You're completely ordinary, and you'll stay ordinary until the day you die." Catherine felt heat rising in her cheeks. She'd always known Richard could be arrogant, but she'd never seen him be outright cruel to someone who couldn't fight back. "Maybe if you understood what real talent looks like," she said, her voice sharp, "you'd show more respect. Like those musicians inside, and they have genuine skill, genuine artistry." Richard turned his cruel smile toward her. "Talent? Real talent?" "Catherine, darling, talent is making $200 million before you turn 40. Talent is building something from nothing. These service people don't have any real abilities. The words hung in the air for a moment. Catherine's eyes flashed with anger. Fine, Richard. If you're so sure about who has talent and who doesn't, why don't you prove it? I bet if Michael here could play piano like the musicians inside, you wouldn't be so quick to judge him. Piano? Richard's laugh was nasty now. You think this doorman can play piano? Catherine, you're being ridiculous. But something in her expression made him pause. The crowd was watching intently, and Richard realized he had an opportunity to make his point even more dramatically. He could humiliate this doorman completely and show everyone exactly what he thought about people who worked service jobs. You know what? Richard said, his voice carrying across the entrance area. I'll tell you what, Catherine. If this doorman, this nobody who opens doors for a living, if he can actually play piano, really play, not just poke at some keys, then I'll marry him instead of you. The crowd gasped and murmured. Several people laughed nervously. Catherine stared at her fiancé in shock. She'd meant to defend Michael's dignity, not set up some impossible challenge. Richard was grinning now, pleased with his own cleverness. That's right, everyone heard it. If Mr. Thompson here can actually play piano, I mean really play like a professional, then I guess I'll have to break my engagement to this beautiful woman and marry the doorman instead. More laughter rippled through the crowd, though some people looked uncomfortable with how far this had gone. Michael stood perfectly still, his face unreadable. But something had changed in his eyes. The polite professional mask had slipped just slightly, revealing something deeper underneath. That's a very interesting proposition, Mr. Sterling, Michael said quietly. His voice was different now, still respectful, but with a confidence that hadn't been there before. And you're saying this in front of all these witnesses? Richard spread his arms wide, playing to his audience. Absolutely. Everyone here can hold me to it. If the doorman can play piano like a real musician, I'll marry him instead of Catherine. But when he fails, in which he will, maybe people will finally understand the difference between those who achieve greatness and those who just exist. Catherine looked at Michael with new eyes. Something about his posture had changed. He stood straighter now, and there was a look in his eyes she'd never seen before. It almost looked like anticipation. All right, Mr. Sterling, Michael said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. I accept your challenge. The news spread through the Grandview Country Club like wildfire. Within minutes, everyone at the engagement party was talking about what had happened at the entrance. Groups of well-dressed guests whispered and pointed, some laughing at the absurdity of it all, others shaking their heads at Richard's behavior. Did you hear what Richard Sterling said to the doorman? He promised to marry the guy if he can play piano. That poor man must be so embarrassed. Richard went too far this time. Catherine felt sick to her stomach as she moved through the party. Every conversation stopped when she approached, and she could see people watching her with a mixture of pity and curiosity. This was supposed to be her engagement celebration, but instead it had become a spectacle of her fiancé's cruelty. Richard, meanwhile, seemed to be enjoying himself immensely. He moved from group to group, retelling the story with growing embellishment, making himself the hero who had put an entitled service worker in his place. He didn't seem to notice or care about the uncomfortable expressions on some of his guests' faces. The look on his face when I made the challenge. Richard laughed to a group of his business associates. He probably never touched a piano in his life. This whole thing will be over in 5 minutes when he admits he was just trying to get attention. But Catherine couldn't stop thinking about the look in Michael's eyes when he accepted the challenge. There had been something there, not fear or embarrassment, but something else entirely. Something that almost looked like confidence. As the evening wore on, Catherine found herself unable to enjoy her own party. The music from the string quartet felt hollow. The congratulations from friends felt empty, and Richard's boasting made her feel ashamed. When she finally couldn't take it anymore, she slipped away from the main hall. She found Michael in the staff break room, sitting alone at a small table with a cup of coffee. He'd changed out of his doorman jacket and was wearing just a simple white shirt. He looked tired, and Catherine noticed for the first time how much older he seemed than she'd thought. Michael? She said softly from the doorway. May I come in? He looked up, surprised. Ms. Ashford, you shouldn't be back here. The party can wait. Catherine stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. I wanted to apologize. For Richard, for what happened. What he said to you was completely unacceptable. Michael managed a small smile. It's not your fault, and I've heard worse. No, you shouldn't have to hear anything like that ever. Catherine sat down across from him, something she realized she'd never done in all the years she'd known him. Richard was out of line, and I'm sorry you were put in that position. Thank you, Michael said quietly. That means more than you know. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Catherine found herself really looking at Michael for the first time. She'd always seen him as part of the club's furniture, polite, reliable, practically invisible. But now she noticed details she'd missed before. His posture was straight and dignified despite what had happened. His voice when he spoke was educated and thoughtful. And his hands, Catherine's eyes fixed on Michael's hands as he held his coffee cup. They were not the soft, uncalloused hands she would have expected from someone who spent his days opening doors. Instead, she saw fingertips that were slightly flattened and hardened, with small calluses in very specific places. Michael, she said slowly, can I ask you something? Of course. Your hands. Those calluses on your fingertips. They're not from opening doors, are they? Michael's expression changed instantly. He quickly set down his coffee cup and folded his hands in his lap, as if trying to hide them. What do you mean? I took piano lessons for 12 years, Catherine said gently. I know what a pianist's hands look like. Those calluses come from pressing strings, don't they? You play. For a long moment, Michael didn't answer. Catherine could see a struggle playing out on his face as if he was deciding whether to trust her with something important. I used to, he finally admitted. A long time ago. What kind of music? Classical, mostly. Michael's voice was barely above a whisper. But that was a different life. Catherine leaned forward. Michael, when Richard made that challenge, you didn't look scared. You looked, I don't know how to describe it. Like you knew something he didn't. Michael met her eyes for the first time since she'd entered the room. Maybe I did. An idea began forming in Catherine's mind. The club has that beautiful grand piano in the main hall. After the party ends, when everyone's gone. Would you consider showing me what you can do? Ms. Ashford, I don't think, please. Call me Catherine. And please, just consider it. Not for Richard, not for anyone else, just... I have a feeling there's more to this story. Michael was quiet for a long time. Catherine could see him thinking, weighing something in his mind. Finally, he nodded slowly. All right, he said. But just you. And you have to promise me something. What? Promise me that whatever you hear tonight, whatever you see, you won't tell Richard until I'm ready. Catherine agreed, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was agreeing to. The party finally ended around midnight. Catherine made her excuses to Richard, claiming she had a headache and needed to go home early. Instead, she waited in her car until she saw the last of the catering staff leave. Then she used her family's key to slip back into the club through the side entrance. The main hall was dark except for a few security lights. The grand piano sat in the center of the room like a sleeping giant, its black surface reflecting the dim light. Catherine had always thought it was beautiful, but tonight it seemed almost magical. She heard footsteps and turned to see Michael approaching from the staff corridor. He'd changed again, this time into dark slacks and a navy sweater. He moved differently now, not with the careful, deferential steps of a doorman, but with the confident stride of someone who belonged in this space. Are you sure about this? He asked. I'm sure. Michael walked to the piano bench and sat down. He lifted the lid carefully as if he were handling something precious. His fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, and Catherine held her breath. Then he began to play. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the empty hall, and Catherine felt her world shift. This wasn't the careful, studied playing of an amateur. This wasn't even the skilled performance of a good student. This was something else entirely. Michael's fingers moved across the keys with incredible precision and grace. The music that poured from the piano was rich and complex, filled with emotion that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. Catherine found herself holding her breath, afraid that any sound might break the spell. But as she listened more carefully, she began to notice something. Every so often, there was the slightest hesitation, a tiny break in the flow of notes. It was so subtle that most people would never notice it, but Catherine's trained ear picked it up. Something was different about his left hand, not wrong exactly, but not quite perfect either. When the piece ended, Michael sat with his hands resting on the keys, his head bowed. Catherine realized there were tears on his cheeks. "Michael," she whispered. "Who are you?" Michael kept his hands on the piano keys for a long moment, as if drawing strength from the instrument. The question hung in the air between them. "Who are you?" Catherine watched as different emotions played across his face. She could see him struggling with something, some decision about whether to trust her with whatever secret he'd been carrying. "That's a complicated question," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have time," Catherine said gently, moving closer. "And after what I just heard, I think I deserve an honest answer." Michael lifted his hands from the keys and looked at them as if seeing them for the first time. "These hands," he said slowly, "they used to be able to do things you can't imagine." "What do you mean?" He stood up from the piano bench and walked to one of the tall windows overlooking the club's gardens. Catherine followed, giving him space but staying close enough to hear his words. "My name isn't Michael Thompson," he began. "Well, it is now legally, but I was born Daniel Morimoto." Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. Something about that name sounded familiar, like a half-remembered melody. "When I was 7 years old," Michael continued, "my parents discovered I could play piano. Not just play, really play. By the time I was 8, I was performing with the local symphony. By 10, I was traveling to competitions across the country. The pieces started falling into place in Catherine's mind. Daniel Morimoto? She'd heard that name before, years ago. "The child prodigy," she whispered. "I remember reading about you in the newspapers when I was young." Michael nodded, still looking out the window. "By the time I was 15, I was performing with major orchestras. The New York Philharmonic, the Boston Symphony. Music critics called me the next great American pianist. I had recording contracts waiting, concert tours planned for years in advance." "What happened?" Michael was quiet for so long that Catherine thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I was 17. It was December 23rd, 1998. We were driving home from a concert in Philadelphia. It was snowing and the roads were bad, but we wanted to get home for Christmas Eve with my grandparents." Catherine's heart began to race. She had a terrible feeling about where this story was going. "A drunk driver ran a red light," Michael continued. "Hit us on my father's side of the car. He died instantly. My mother, she held on for 3 days in the hospital, but the injuries were too severe." "Oh, Michael," Catherine breathed, her hand covering her mouth. "I was in the back seat behind my mother. The impact threw me against the door so hard that I crushed the nerves in my left arm. For months, the doctors weren't sure if I'd ever be able to use my hand normally again." Michael held up his left hand, flexing the fingers slowly. "After 2 years of surgery and physical therapy, I got most of the function back. Most, but not all. There's still damage to some of the smaller nerves. You can't see it, but it's there." Catherine thought about the slight hesitations she'd noticed in his playing, the tiny breaks in the flow of notes. "That's what I heard tonight," she said. "The slight tremor. It's not much," Michael said. "Most people would never notice it. But when you're supposed to be performing at the highest level in the world, when thousands of people are paying to hear perfection, even the smallest imperfection might as well be a complete failure. But you can still play beautifully. What you just did was incredible." Michael finally turned away from the window to look at her. "Beautiful isn't enough when you're supposed to be one of the greatest pianists of your generation. The first time I tried to perform after the accident, the critics tore me apart. They said I'd lost my edge, that the magic was gone." "They were right. So you just gave up?" "I tried to keep going for 2 more years. I practiced 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours a day, trying to work around the nerve damage. But every performance was a reminder of what I used to be able to do. Every review compared me to the prodigy I used to be." Michael sat back down at the piano bench, his shoulders sagging with the weight of the memories. The worst part wasn't the physical limitation. It was the pity. Everyone in the classical music world knew my story. Concert audiences would applaud extra loud, not because I'd played well, but because they felt sorry for me. Critics would give me gentle reviews, making excuses for mistakes they would have destroyed other pianists for making. That must have been awful. I couldn't take it anymore, so I disappeared, changed my name, moved across the country, and decided never to touch a piano again. That was 25 years ago. Catherine felt tears welling up in her eyes. "You've been working as a doorman for 25 years? With your talent? It's honest work, Michael said defensively. And it allowed me to disappear completely. Daniel Morimoto just vanished from the music world. Eventually, people stopped asking what happened to me. But why didn't you try teaching? Or playing in smaller venues? There had to be other options. Michael's laugh was bitter. You don't understand. When you've been at the top of the mountain, when you've played Carnegie Hall and had the world at your feet, everything else feels like failure. I couldn't bear to be a small-town piano teacher, giving lessons to kids who would never be as good as I was at age 10. So you chose to give up music entirely? I told myself it was better that way. If I couldn't be the best, if I couldn't be perfect, then I wouldn't play at all. Michael's hands moved unconsciously to the keys again. But you know what's funny? In all these years, I never stopped hearing music in my head. Every day, all day long, there were melodies and harmonies running through my mind. It was like torture sometimes. Catherine moved to sit beside him on the piano bench. Is that why you accepted Richard's challenge? Are you planning to play? Michael nodded slowly. When he said those things about me tonight, about me being nobody, having no talent, no abilities, something inside me snapped. For 25 years, I've let the world believe I was nothing special. But I'm tired of hiding. The slight tremor in your left hand, will people notice it? Some will. Anyone with real musical training will probably pick up on it. But you know what I realized tonight when I played for you? Michael turned to look at Catherine directly. I don't care anymore. I'm not 17 years old trying to be the world's greatest pianist. I'm 42 years old and I've wasted enough of my life being ashamed of not being perfect. Catherine felt a surge of admiration for this man she'd never really seen before.
What are you going to play?
I haven't decided yet. But whatever I choose, I'm going to play it with everything I have left, even if it's not perfect, even if people notice the flaws. Michael's voice grew stronger as he spoke. Richard Sterling thinks he knows what talent looks like. He thinks it's about money and success and never failing at anything. But real talent, real artistry, it's about taking your broken pieces and making something beautiful anyway. What about after? If you do this, if you reveal who you are, there's no going back to being invisible. Michael smiled for the first time since she'd entered the break room hours ago. Maybe that's exactly what I need. Maybe I've been invisible long enough. Catherine reached out and gently touched one of his hands. For what it's worth, I think you're incredibly brave. We'll see about that when I'm sitting at that piano tomorrow night with everyone watching. Michael looked at the instrument with a mixture of love and fear. I haven't performed for an audience in 25 years. I'm terrified. You'll do beautifully, Catherine said with certainty. And no matter what happens, you'll finally be free. Word of the challenge had spread far beyond the Grandview Country Club. By the next evening, news of Richard Sterling's bizarre promise had reached social media, local newspapers, and even a few television stations. The story was too good to ignore. Wealthy tech mogul promises to marry Doorman if he can play piano. Richard loved every minute of the attention. He spent the day giving interviews, portraying himself as a successful businessman who was simply trying to teach someone about knowing their place in life. This is really about helping people understand their limitations, he told one reporter. Sometimes kindness means helping people face reality. But privately, Richard was also busy making sure the evening would go exactly as he planned. He contacted several local news outlets, invited prominent members of the business community, and even arranged for professional video equipment to capture what he was certain would be Michael's humiliation. This will be over in 30 seconds, Richard told his assistant while reviewing the guest list. The poor guy will sit down, realize he can't actually play, and slink away embarrassed. Then everyone will understand what real success looks like. Catherine, meanwhile, spent the day feeling increasingly nervous. She hadn't told Richard about her conversation with Michael, but she couldn't stop thinking about what she'd witnessed the night before. Part of her wanted to warn Michael about how big this had become, but another part of her believed he needed to make this decision himself. By 7 o'clock that evening, the club's main hall was packed. Word had gotten out through social media, and people had been calling all day trying to get in. The club manager, seeing an opportunity for publicity, had decided to treat it as a special event and charged admission, with proceeds going to charity. The crowd was unlike anything the State Old Club had ever seen. Along with the usual wealthy members, there were reporters, curious locals, and people who had driven from neighboring towns just to see what would happen. Some came expecting entertainment, Others came hoping to see an arrogant rich man get his comeuppance. Richard stood near the front of the room, clearly enjoying being the center of attention. He wore his most expensive suit and kept checking his watch, making sure everyone saw his platinum timepiece. Catherine stood beside him, but her attention kept drifting to the doorway where she expected Michael to appear. "Ladies and gentlemen," the club manager announced from a small stage they'd set up, "thank you all for joining us for this very unique event. As you know, Mr. Sterling has made quite an interesting proposition." The crowd murmured with excitement. Camera phones were already out, and the professional cameras Richard had arranged were positioned around the room. "Before we begin," the manager continued, "I think Mr. Sterling would like to say a few words." Richard stepped forward, his confident smile never wavering. "Thank you all for coming. I know this might seem unusual, but I believe it's important to have these teachable moments in life." Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Richard's tone was condescending, as if he were addressing children. You see, in today's world, everyone thinks they're special. Everyone believes they have hidden talents just waiting to be discovered. But the truth is, most people are exactly what they appear to be. Success isn't an accident. It comes from real ability, real vision, and real work. Catherine felt her stomach turn. She could see where this was going. So when our doorman friend claims he can play piano, well, I think it's important to let him try. Not to embarrass him, of course, but to help all of us understand the difference between fantasy and reality. The crowd was getting restless. Some people were nodding along with Richard's words, but others looked increasingly uncomfortable with his attitude. "And here he is now," Richard announced, gesturing toward the back of the room. Everyone turned to see Michael walking through the crowd. He was dressed simply in a dark suit that had seen better years, but he carried himself differently than he had the night before. His shoulders were straight, his steps were confident, and there was something in his expression that hadn't been there in all his years working at the club. As Michael made his way toward the piano, the crowd parted like water. Some people whispered to each other, trying to guess what was about to happen. Others held up their phones to record whatever came next. "There he is," Richard said loudly, his voice carrying across the room. "Our musical Doorman. I have to admit, I'm curious to see what he's learned from YouTube tutorials." A few people laughed, but the sound was nervous and uncertain. Michael reached the piano and stood beside it for a moment, looking out at the sea of faces watching him. Catherine could see him taking slow, deep breaths. "Well?" Richard called out. "We're all waiting. Show us this amazing talent of yours." Michael turned to look directly at Richard. When he spoke, his voice was calm and clear, carrying easily across the silent room. "Mr. Sterling, you said that some people are meant to achieve greatness, and others are meant to serve. You said that talent and success are obvious, that extraordinary people can't hide what they are." "That's right," Richard replied, still smiling confidently. "Well, you're absolutely right about one thing. Extraordinary people can't hide forever." Something in Michael's tone made the smile slip slightly from Richard's face. Michael sat down at the piano bench and placed his hands on the keys. For just a moment he closed his eyes, and Catherine saw his lips move slightly, as if he were saying a prayer or making a promise to someone who wasn't there. Then he began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 filled the room, and everything changed. This wasn't the careful, tentative playing of an amateur. This wasn't even the competent performance of a good student. From the very first measure, it was clear that something extraordinary was happening. Michael's fingers moved across the keys with incredible grace and precision. The melody soared and danced, filled with emotion that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. The technical passages that would challenge even advanced pianists flowed from his hands like water. The crowd fell completely silent. Phone cameras that had been raised to capture an embarrassing moment now recorded something beautiful and unexpected. People who had come expecting a spectacle found themselves witnessing artistry. Catherine watched Richard's face change as the performance continued. His confident smile disappeared, replaced first by confusion, then by growing alarm. This was not at all what he had expected, but it was the emotion in Michael's playing that truly captivated the audience. Every note carried the weight of years of silence, of dreams deferred, of a talent that had been hidden away for too long. There were passages of incredible sadness, but also moments of pure joy, as if Michael were rediscovering something he thought he'd lost forever. About halfway through the piece, Catherine noticed the slight hesitation she'd heard the night before, the tiny pause where the nerve damage in Michael's left hand affected his timing. But instead of making the performance less powerful, it somehow made it more human, more real. When Michael reached the final, thunderous climax of the ballade, his hands moving in perfect coordination despite the old injury, several people in the audience were openly crying. The music filled every corner of the room, and for those few minutes nothing else in the world mattered. The last note rang out and slowly faded into silence. For a long moment, nobody moved. The room was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Then someone started clapping, just one person. Then another. Then suddenly the entire room erupted in applause. People leaped to their feet, shouting and cheering. The ovation went on for nearly 5 minutes, with people refusing to stop clapping. Michael sat at the piano bench with tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the response. Richard stood frozen in place, his face pale with shock and humiliation. The applause seemed to go on forever. People were on their feet, clapping and cheering, some wiping away tears. Camera phones captured every moment as Michael sat at the piano, overwhelmed by the response he hadn't experienced in 25 years. Richard stood frozen near the front of the room, his face cycling through different shades of red and white. The confident smirk he'd worn all evening had vanished completely. He looked around desperately, as if hoping to find some way to regain control of the situation. When the applause finally died down, an uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Everyone seemed to be waiting for someone to speak, to explain what they had just witnessed. Richard cleared his throat loudly. "Well," he said, his voice strained but still trying to maintain authority. "That was unexpected. I mean, it was fine, I suppose. Anyone can learn to play a song if they practice enough." Several people in the crowd made sounds of disagreement, but Richard pressed on. "But let's be realistic here. Playing one piece doesn't make someone a professional musician. I'm sure with enough YouTube videos and practice time, most people could—" "Stop." Catherine's voice cut through Richard's rambling. She stepped forward, and everyone could see the anger in her eyes. "Just stop talking." Richard looked surprised. "Catherine, what are you—" "What I just witnessed wasn't someone who learned a song on YouTube," Catherine said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "That was the performance of someone who has dedicated their entire life to music. Someone with years of professional training and natural talent that most people can only dream of." "Catherine, you're being dramatic." "No, Richard. You're being cruel and stupid." Catherine turned to address the entire room. What this man just showed us wasn't just technical skill. It was artistry. It was emotion and passion and years of experience. And instead of recognizing something beautiful, you're trying to diminish it because it threatens your ego. The crowd murmured in agreement. People were nodding and several shouted, "That's right." "And tell him." Michael stood up from the piano bench slowly. He looked out at the sea of faces watching him, many still showing the emotion his music had stirred in them. "There's something you all should know," Michael said, his voice quiet but somehow reaching every corner of the room. "My name isn't actually Michael Thompson. I changed it many years ago because I was running away from who I used to be." The room fell silent again, everyone straining to hear his words. "My real name is Daniel Morimoto. Some of you might remember that name from years ago." Catherine heard several gasps from the crowd. A woman near the back called out, "The child prodigy." "I remember you." "Yes," Michael nodded. "I was that child. I performed with major orchestras, had recording contracts, and a future that seemed limitless. But when I was 17, my parents were killed in a car accident that also damaged my left hand. I lost my family and my career in one night." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. "For 25 years, I've been hiding from who I was, ashamed that I wasn't perfect anymore, that I couldn't be the great pianist everyone expected me to become. I convinced myself it was better to be nobody than to be a flawed version of what I used to be." Michael looked directly at Richard. "But tonight someone reminded me what real courage looks like. It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to show the world who you really are, flaws and all." Richard's face had gone completely pale. The reporters in the crowd were frantically taking notes, realizing they had stumbled onto a much bigger story than they'd expected. "So, Mr. Sterling," Michael continued, "you were right about one thing. Some people are meant for greatness, but you were wrong about what greatness looks like. It's not about money or power or putting others down to make yourself feel important. True greatness is about lifting others up, about recognizing beauty and talent wherever you find it. Catherine felt a surge of pride and admiration. She walked over to Richard and, without saying a word, pulled off her engagement ring and placed it in his hand. "Catherine, what are you doing?" Richard stammered. "I'm ending our engagement," Catherine said simply. "What I saw tonight wasn't just incredible music. I saw who you really are when you think you have power over someone else. And I saw who Michael really is when he decided to stop hiding." Richard looked around the room desperately. "This is ridiculous. You can't be serious. Over some doorman with a sob story?" "He's not just some doorman," Catherine replied. "And this isn't about him. This is about you, and the fact that I've finally seen your true character." The crowd was watching this personal drama unfold with fascination. Several people had their phones out, recording everything. "Mr. Sterling," came a voice from the back of the room. "Jennifer Walsh, Channel 7 News. You made a public promise that if this man could play piano, you would marry him instead of Ms. Ashford? Given what we've all witnessed tonight, do you plan to keep your word?" Richard's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The absurdity of his original boast was now crystal clear to everyone in the room. "I think," Michael said with a slight smile, "Mr. Sterling is going to need some time to think about that." The crowd erupted in laughter and applause again. Over the following weeks, the video of Michael's performance went viral online. The story of Daniel Morimoto's return touched millions of people around the world. Music lovers who remembered the young prodigy shared their memories, and new fans discovered his incredible talent. More importantly, Michael found himself receiving offers from music schools wanting him to teach, from small orchestras inviting him to perform, and from recording companies interested in his story. For the first time in 25 years, he began to see a future in music again. He didn't accept every offer. He was selective, choosing opportunities that felt right for who he was now, not who he used to be. He started teaching advanced students at a local music conservatory and began performing in smaller venues where the focus was on the music itself rather than celebrity. Catherine and Michael began spending more time together, first as friends and then as something more. She discovered that his years of exile had given him a depth and wisdom that her privileged world had never offered her. 6 months later, Michael stood backstage at the City Symphony Hall, preparing for his first major performance since his return to music. It wasn't as a soloist this time, but as a featured artist in a special concert about resilience and second chances. Catherine sat in the front row, watching as he walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. He sat at the piano, placed his hands on the keys, and began to play. The slight tremor in his left hand was still there. Some critics would probably notice it and comment on it in their reviews, but Michael no longer cared about being perfect. He cared about being real, about sharing his gift despite its limitations. As the music filled the hall, Catherine smiled. She had learned something important that night at the country club. The most beautiful music often comes from instruments that have been broken and carefully put back together. They don't sound exactly the same as they did before, but sometimes they sound even better, richer, deeper, and more full of meaning. Michael had stopped hiding from the world, and the world was better for it.